Welcome to part 2 of Unit 5.11 notes on the Paris Peace Conference. Now that we understand what was going on at the PPC, let's really dive into understanding what these three countries and these three leaders were actually thinking. Since we already know that technically they, Great Britain, France, and the United States, are pretty much going to be the ones running the show. President Woodrow Wilson. President Woodrow Wilson is the President of the United States, and he wanted to create an eternal peace, meaning a peace that would last forever. And he believed that this eternal peace could be achieved by creating the League of Nations. The League of Nations is basically going to be an international referee group, a group of countries that come together, kind of like an alliance, but rather than promising to go to war for each other, they're kind of promising to support each other and try to help each other create and maintain peace. So it's really more of kind of like, think of like a group of referees at a soccer game. The group of referees are not trying to start fights with the soccer players, and they're not trying to create fights. They're kind of more there to blow their whistles and kind of like stop issues from happening. And so President Woodrow Wilson wants to create this international referee group with all these different countries who will promise to come together and to help resolve issues and to basically help ensure peace lasts. Now, in order to achieve his dream of an eternal peace after World War I, he drafted a document called the 14 Points. And this document basically outlined 14 things that he believed the post-World War I nations, the countries after World War I, should do and not do. So he pretty much kind of made like this list of 14 rules. An example of one of the things in his 14 Points document was the idea of self-determination. He believed that after World War I, countries should allow for self-determination, and that basically meant that all people would be able to rule themselves rather than being victims, rather than being subject to other nationalities, to other bullies. So he's pretty much here trying to end imperialism and saying that victim countries should be given their freedom, should be given their self-determination. He also said that it was important for post-World War I countries to disarm. Disarmament is the idea that countries are going to reduce and eliminate their arms, their weapons. This is the exact opposite of militarism. So we can see that in the 14 Points document, Woodrow Wilson is completely against 1, imperialism, and 2, militarism. Now, he realized that some of his requests in the 14-point documents probably would not be accepted by all of the countries at the PPC. And so he was prepared to compromise on some of his requests in the document. He was able to kind of compromise on some of these 14 requests as long as the countries at the PPC agreed that one of the requests would in fact be granted. And that one request he wanted granted for sure was the League of Nations. If this peacekeeping international group could be created, then Woodrow Wilson could maybe scratch off some of the other requests on his list. He was okay with that. Now, because he had these dreams of an eternal peace, and because he kind of made this 14 lists of what some people would say butterfly requests that really would never be agreed on by everyone, a lot of people quote him as the dreamer of the group, as the person who just really had his head up in the clouds and wasn't thinking realistically about how the PPC was going to actually end. Let's jump into our second leader, which is President Georges Clément. He is the president of France. And he is a 77-year-old man who, in his 77 years of life, has seen France invaded twice by Germany. He's seen France invaded during the Franco-Prussian War, which they lost. We learned about that at the beginning of the unit. And he's also seen France invaded during World War I. Now, because he has these negative experiences of seeing his country attacked twice by Germany, he's going to come into the PPC conference determined to get vengeance, determined to get revenge from Germany. And specifically, he wants to see this revenge happen by having the PPC politically economically and militarily weaken Germany. He wants to see the PPC create a treaty that will just smash Germany to pieces. He also wants to ensure that the treaty that ends World War I allows him to place French troops on the German-French border. These troops would be placed on the territory called the Rhineland, and these troops would basically be there to kind of protect France from any future German attack. He also stated that on this Rhineland territory, Germany would not be able to send any soldiers, and Germany would not be able to have any weapons. He also demanded that the treaty to end World War I state that Germany had to return Alsace and Lorraine to France. If you remember, Alsace and Lorraine was a piece of French territory that the French lost after the Franco-Prussian War. He also stated that Germany had to pay all the costs that the war had basically piled up on for France. So all of the money that France had spent on winning this war and all of the money that France now owed for fighting this war, France was demanding that Germany pay that. So France is basically demanding reparations, payback money from Germany. Now, if we take a look at the picture, we can see that the reparations, the payback money that France is demanding from Germany was such a large amount that it would literally crush and destroy Germany. Because President George Clemenceau comes in with such an aggressive, angry attitude to the PPC, he's often called the Tiger, specifically the Tiger against Germany. Now, keep in mind that Germany technically didn't have anything to do with the trigger cause of World War I. The trigger cause was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which technically was carried out by a Serbian nationalist called Gavrilo Princip from Serbia, who went over to Austria-Hungary to assassinate the heir. However, keep in mind that a lot of people are going to still blame Germany for causing the war because of that blank check support they gave Austria-Hungary. The last leader is Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and Prime Minister is basically the British name for president. Now, David Lloyd George wants Germany punished, but he's not as blood-hungry as France. He doesn't necessarily want Germany punished as bad as France does. He's also very worried. He's very worried about some of the countries after World War I possibly turning communist. If you can remember, communism is the idea that people should have economic equality, meaning that everyone has the same amount of money, the same types of products, etc. Now, communism was scary to Prime Minister David Lloyd George because he's a capitalist, and capitalists and communists don't get alike. Prime Minister David Lloyd George is very worried that the poor and broken losing nations of World War I are going to be so economically hurt with loss of jobs, having to pay reparations, loss of food, loss of life, loss of the war, that they might resort to communism. He wants to try to avoid this. Keep that in the back of your mind. He also is kind of in a little bit of a problem because he's just recently been elected as prime minister. And because he's just recently been elected as prime minister, he feels the pressure to make his people happy. He just got elected because he promised the people he was going to change things. He promised the people of Britain things were going to get better after World War I. Most of the people in Britain after World War I want Germany punished. The prime minister feels pressured of upholding his promise to make things better. He feels pressured to not let the people down and to not disappoint the people. And so he's really kind of confused about what he should do. He doesn't want to punish Germany too much, but he doesn't want to upset his own people. He also disagreed with some of Wilson's 14 points. He disagreed with the fact that Wilson wants the post-World War I countries to disarm. He thinks it's a complete mistake for all the countries after World War I to reduce their weapons and reduce their soldiers. Otherwise, how are we going to protect ourselves, he asks. He also disagrees with Wilson's request for the elimination of imperialism. Remember that imperialism is when a bully country bullies the victim country. Great Britain is one of the biggest bully countries of this time. They have a huge empire, controlling territory all over Asia, controlling territory all over Africa. And if the elimination of imperialism actually did happen, then Great Britain would lose a lot of its victim countries, which would mean loss of land, loss of money, loss of power. And Prime Minister David Lloyd George just cannot agree to have his country lose this much power. He also is not quite sure he agrees with some of the changes in trade that Wilson is asking for. In his 14 points, and we'll learn this next week, in the 14 points document, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson is asking that trade become more fair, that all countries be allowed to trade, that there's no restrictions on trade, that trade prices are fair, and that trade relationships are conducted civilly. Great Britain doesn't quite agree with a lot of these fair trade requests because these fair trade requests would ultimately take away some of their power, some of their money, because being one of the biggest bullies kind of allows them to kind of do some unfair trading things that give them power. Now, if we take a look, we've already looked at the major powers, United States, Great Britain, and France. If we take a look now at the second level of powers, we're going to be looking at the minor powers and their desires and their opinions. Now, these minor powers, like I mentioned, they had been on the Allied Powers Alliance, and thus they want compensation. They want payment for helping the victory of World War I. Some examples of these minor powers were Italy. Italy was a smaller power, helped Great Britain, France, and the U.S. win World War I. And now that the war is over, at the PPC conference, Italy wants territory. Specifically, it wants the Balkan Peninsula coastline so it can open up a port for ships. These ships would allow Italy to have some really great trading connections that'll boost Italy's economy. At the PPC, another minor power country is Japan. Japan was also on the Allied Powers Alliance, helping Serbia, America, Great Britain, and France win, and they want some compensation too. They want to be given some land that belongs to China, and they are going to demand this land for having helped win World War I. Greece is another minor power country. They are also demanding land for compensation. They want this land that is located also in the Balkan Peninsula. Now, these minor powers, even though they're at the PPC, they realize very quickly that because they're minor powers and they don't have a lot of talking time at the PPC, they don't have a lot of power to make decisions at the PPC, they don't have a lot of power to actually write the treaties, they realize that their power is limited. And so they decide that one of the ways for them to be able to get what they want is going to be if Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations is created. Remember, the League of Nations is supposed to be a peacekeeping referee organization, and one of the key ways for the League of Nations to keep peace is by maintaining fairness. Therefore, these minor power countries believe the only way they will be treated fairly and the only way they'll get the compensation they want is if the League of Nations is created. And so these minor powers are really going to push for the League of Nations to be created and accepted at the PPC. Remember that the League of Nations, even though it's popular with Woodrow Wilson and it's popular with these minor powers, the League of Nations is not popular with countries like France, or not popular with countries like Great Britain. It is not popular with Great Britain or France because these two countries fear the League of Nations will not allow them to punish Germany, or that the League of Nations will take away some of their power after World War I. This portion of our podcast is about to end. Once it stops, please make sure that you go ahead and click on Part 3.